clapping there for just a minute, and I thought, oh no, this is going to get out of control. We could clap. It's okay. We could clap. There's nothing wrong with that. Psalm. We're going to start in Psalm 93 today, and like I have on your sheet there, we're doing some highlights, really reviewing some great attributes of God, the greatness of the majesty of God, the greatness of God, the superiority of God, and whatever of those we don't get this week, we'll get them next week. But some terrific passages here about God. I try to be really encouraging when people come to me and are discouraged about the state of Christianity today or of the evangelical churches. I know it's kind of difficult, but I have to say I get a little discouraged as well for a variety of reasons that I express to you about every other week or so. I will say one thing that I think is a danger that we need to be careful of, and that is that modern evangelicalism has really become more about the church than it is about God. Look at our church. Look at our programs. Come hear our pastor. We got things for the kids and the teens and the elderly and the senior saints and for singles and all these kinds of things. I think we're trying to impress people with our facilities rather than impressing the world with our God. The psalmists were extraordinarily impressed with God. They'll talk about the temple. They'll talk about Israel. They'll talk about the law. They'll talk about these other aspects of their faith and culture. But what they want to promote about who they are is God, and that's the best thing they can promote. I think in a lot of ways we're missing an opportunity. We say, "Come to our church, see the program, see the thing." And we should say, "You should be attracted to our God because He is great. He is surpassing. He is majestic." And He will make a big difference in your life. It is hard to read this section of Psalms with care and attention and not be profoundly impressed with who God is and how they portray Him. We're going to hit some highlights from some of these Psalms today that point to how impressive and majestic our God is. And I would suggest we should leverage that in at least two ways. First of all, our own spiritual growth, to think what takes up a lot of your time and attention. If it's something other than God, then I think we're squandering our time and attention. Our time and attention should be given to God. He is the best thing by far in our lives. Christ the Savior, the redemption that we have, the grace, the Holy Spirit indwelling us as a community. These things should be our top priority. But I think we could also leverage this as we promote our faith and witness to others. Now, I just said a few minutes ago, we have the Seder dinner, so you should invite people to our church because of the Seder dinner. You should still do that. Okay. But I hope people would say, you know the thing about that church? It's their God. It's God. God is great at that church. And they're in the Word of God, and they're worshiping God, and they love God, and they're trying to serve God. I wish God would become the most important thing in churches. Unfortunately, sometimes I think in modern evangelicalism, it is the church that eclipses and hides God. We're going to look at three, and maybe you want to use different words or different terms. You can if you want to, but three attributes of God in these three Psalms. Psalm 93, the majesty of God. Now, you remember a couple of weeks ago, we spent the whole week on Psalm 94, the vengeance of God. In fact, I think we awkwardly did that the day we started singing Christmas songs as well. That was not the best planning on my part, but we did it anyway. Fa la 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 la, and then the vengeance of God. But that's okay. It worked. It worked. God pulls it together. So we're skipping 94 because we've done it 95, the greatness of God, and then 96, the superiority of God. And by the way, that is an important part of the message of the Old Testament, that God is great. He is superior to any God that could be fabricated, that could be made up by the nations. He is the one true and only and greatest God, and we want to celebrate and really spend time on those things today. So let's start with the majesty of God. We're in Psalm 93. Let me just read the first two verses for us, and we'll talk about those for a few minutes. Psalm 93, verses 1. Well, we read these already, didn't we? But let me just kind of review a little bit. The Lord reigns. He is clothed with majesty. The Lord has clothed and girded himself with strength. Indeed, the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. Your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. I feel like if we were on a desert island and this was the only verses that we have, we would have a great systematic theology about God, about the greatness, about the majesty, about the rule of God, just from these verses. Fortunately, we have a lot more than that, but let's focus on these verses for just a few minutes. Psalm 93 begins with praise in regard to God's reign and oversight of the world. In fact, Psalm 1 just begins with, or Psalm 93, verse 1 begins with, the Lord, Yahweh. Yahweh is the covenant name of God in the Old Testament. And then it notes that he reigns. He reigns, he rules, he is in control. The Hebrew verb here, or the root is malak, M-L-K. We get the word Melchizedek. Melchizedek is he's king and priest. So that name from Genesis, I don't remember where, but in Genesis. But it's that M-L-K. That means king, or it means to rule or to reign. And he is both. He is king and he rules and he reigns. Now it's interesting then where the psalmist goes from there. You probably don't just meet with the king and have lunch with the king and play tennis with the king. You see the king from afar and you see him in certain kinds of clothes, right? You wouldn't expect to see him in, a jeans shirt or something like that. You'd expect to see him dressed regally, and that's exactly where the psalmist goes. The Lord reigns and he is clothed. This idea of being clothed or having something on. One expects a king to be dressed a certain way in long purple or red robes and perhaps a crown. Thus, the psalmist turns immediately to this metaphorical attire. In fact, he uses the word clothed twice, once in the first line, once in the second line. He appears a certain way. He manifests himself in a certain way. There's everything about him is majestic and regal. You don't walk into this room and say, "Hey, who's in charge around here?" You look at this person and you say, "That guy's in charge." It's easy. It's a no-brainer. So the psalmist turns to this idea of him being clothed. What is he clothed with? He is clothed with majesty. What a great way of saying we don't again with the normal king we would just describe the attire and say, oh wow, what a great robe, and they'd be talking about these the clothes and how regal they are. But for the psalmist it is important that God is clothed with majesty. This is the word. It's a rare word that is only used a few times in Psalms and Isaiah. I think I've got it there in your handout as well. And then he's robed with strength also. Now, I was trying to think, what does it mean to be clothed in majesty? I think part of what it means to be majestic is to have an inherent sense of being a ruler. It is not just something that you were, that was, you're part of a dynasty and you're the next guy in line, so you're going to be the ruler. It's to inherently be able to rule and have the splendor that comes with it. It's the difference between inherent majesty and inherited majesty. Most kings that have ever lived inherited that from, so that was the way they did it in the ancient world, and they still do it in some places today. You inherit the rule and the reign. It's not because it's something you did; it's something you were raised to do. Versus God being inherently majestic. He deserves to rule in our lives as well, by the way. If he is inherently majestic, if he is girded and clothed with these things, he deserves to rule in our lives as well. And I think that's really should be one of the questions for the new year. Uh, Not just do you come to church, are you serving, are you doing something useful for the kingdom of God? Because we could be doing those things and not letting Christ rule in our lives. There could be other reasons why we're doing those things. Is God ruling and reigning with majesty in your life such that you push everything off to the side and say, all I want is to do my work, to raise my family, to have relationships that just glow with the majesty of God? And then it notes that there still in verse 1, he has clothed himself and girded himself with strength, or with these qualities. And I kind of want to camp out on that verb to gird oneself, if I could, for just a minute. Now, I'm gonna go into some kind of really technical stuff here. So if you want to take about a 30-second nap, this is the time. This is the time to do it. But go ahead and do that, and then I'll wake you up when the important stuff comes. But the word here, every Old Testament, every Hebrew verb has what they call a stem, and that stem gives you a little bit of a sense of the nuance of the verb. 69% of Old Testament verbs are in what they call the cal stem, Q-A-L. It just means it's just kind of a normal verb. I go, I come, I fight, I whatever. Then there's the passive. Nifal is passive. Peel is intensive. This is a very unusual one called the hithpael. Hithpael is what we would call reflexive. It's really a combination of active and passive. I both produce the action and I receive the action. Some of you are getting flashbacks to 10th grade English, but stick with me. There's a payoff here, I promise you. There is. If I throw the ball, that's active. If I throw the ball to myself, that's reflexive. If I go to the store and buy groceries, that's active. If I go into the store and buy groceries for myself. So it's usually that phrase for oneself or for himself or for myself that signals the reflexive. Now, that was a lot of time to spend on that, but here's the payoff. So wake up. Uh, Notice that this verb girded is reflexive. He girded, and it says it we see in the translation, he girded himself. You know what that means? Do you understand what that means? Nobody had to provide that for him. A lot of medieval movies that you'll watch, or Lord of the Rings, or some biopic about somebody in the ancient times, they will have an armorer. This person helps them put on their armor. And by the way, remember, they inherited that rule, and then someone helps them put on their armor. They're not a self-made person. All of this came from, they just happened to be born at the right time and be raised to be this ruler, and then people help them with their armor. God was not raised. He was not handed strength. He girds himself with properties that he himself possesses. There is no one else to help him. Again, if you think about the Old Testament and how much they thought about the pantheons, there were groups of gods, not just one god, but groups of gods. He was not, there was not a sense of he was raised up through that pantheon. He raised up through the ranks of that pantheon, and then he was given this armor or something like that. He does this all himself. The result is God's inherent majesty and strength, which is really great because when we need strength, we don't have to say, well, I hope God is girded with strength. He's always girding himself. He's always prepared. He always has strength and possesses that to pass on to us. As we'll see here in just a minute, that majesty that he has, he passes on to creation. So when we're in a less than majestic situation, we need the majesty, we need the reign, we need the rule of God. He doesn't have to, order out for it or something like that. He possesses these things. He will never not possess them. He didn't have to learn these things. He didn't have to grow into them. He possesses these things himself. He inherently deserves the majesty and glory that he wears. No deity or collection of deities had to help him with these things. Again, ancient people believed in that, and we'll see that in the next Psalms as well. The ancient Jewish faith is relatively unique for its monotheism. Yahweh God does not need anyone to help him, gird him, or strengthen him. You think about how ancient pantheons, they had the god of the seas and the god of the land, and then the god of the storm, and then the goddess of fertility, all these things. The Israelites came around and say, you know what, we do that one God. That's all we need. We don't have a whole pantheon. Our God, our God can beat up your God. Well, our God is better than your pantheon. That's really what it comes to, and that makes Jewish religion very unique relative to its other ancient religions. And really, it makes it kind of unique for today as well. We'll come back to that in just a minute. The result of God's inherent majesty and strength is that he bestows stability on the created order. He says, indeed, the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. The world is firmly established, well established. And by the way, remember I just said hithpael, that's reflexive. The verb that is used here for established is passive. The stability of God is passed on to the world. We are not in and of ourselves stable, capable. We don't hold ourselves together. We are held together by the majesty and by the power of God. We have been established by God in his strength and his majesty. Not to diverge too much from that, but if I could just suggest this. I was thinking about this morning. He is strong. He communicates strength and majesty to creation. He expects us to be strong too. That is not in a strength that we concoct ourselves. That is in his strength. But you probably know people around you who have a hard time keeping it together. They're just emotionally, they're weak and they're struggling, and spiritually they're struggling. One of the most important things we can do today is recognize how strong, how majestic God is, to know that he is trying to communicate or to pass that along to his created order, and then as a new creation in Christ, to be strong as an ambassador of his and to be strong for those around us, to encourage believers who are struggling with their faith, to encourage unbelievers who don't have an emotional mooring in a God who loves them. This is a time where we need to be strong with the strength of the Lord, with the strength of the gospel, with the strength of Christ. We need to be strong physically, emotionally, and we need to be strong spiritually. And I would hope that you would pursue those things here in the new year. Furthermore, the it will not be shaken. He says it will not be or moved. Indeed, the world is firmly established. It will not be moved. No ecological catastrophe will occur outside God's watch. He will not, and he will allow the land to be as fruitful as it needs to be to sustain life. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I think we're going to deal with this more in Psalm 96. But when they say, oh, we could destroy the earth, we could destroy the planet, only God can destroy the planet. God made the planet for us to have we talked about the word hubris last hour. It came up in First Timothy. For us to have the arrogance to think that we could destroy the planet is to put ourselves in the place of God. God has made the planet such that only he can make it, only he sustains it, only he will destroy it. And for us to assume anything beyond that is extraordinarily arrogant. The majesty and strength of God is so inherent in his character and deeds that he has communicated a measure of that sustainability and that or stability and creation to his creation, and will oversee creation with wisdom and care. And by the way, that was all just verse 1. That's a lot of incredible things about God, about the God we serve. And again, it makes me think, you know what? It's great that we promote things about our church, but I want to be promoting our God. You know, it's great that we're together. The songs are good. The preacher is okay. But we really need to be promoting God and the gospel of Christ. And even if we just had that verse and said we just promote him from that verse, the majesty, the reign, the rule of God, that would be enough. But he continues, verse 2, your throne is established from of old. You are from everlasting. I love this. He uses the word established again. He just said he's establishing the world. Now he says he establishes his throne. The author notes that God's throne was established when things were created. When he created all things, God's throne was established, an actual place for him to reign and rule. We don't know where this is. No telescope can see it. He is in the heavenlies, but there is a place from where he is reigning and ruling over all of creation, and to maintain his sovereign control and unthwartable purpose over all things. By the way, we're told about this throne room, and I've got a list in your handout there. This throne of God is mentioned there in verse 2. We're told of prophets having glimpses into God's throne room a couple of times. Little visions, veiled visions of the throne room of God. We see it in 1 Kings, Isaiah 6, Daniel 7, and Revelation. We have a whole throne room scene, and very dramatic in Revelation 4 and 5. There is a place from which God rules and reigns. And this verse is telling us about how he established that throne room. And the author uses a simple affirmation about God. You are from everlasting. And by the way, I'm going to keep referring back to Psalm 90. I love how at the beginning of Psalm 90, which is the first psalm in this section of Psalms, he says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We are mortal. We have a beginning and the end. We will be given immortality such that we will be able to endure for all eternity. But God did not have a beginning. God did not have an end. He is from everlasting. This phrase is used of God's eternality, the eternality of his wisdom, but also it is linked to his faithfulness and his loving kindness. It's not just that he's everlasting, but then he changes over time. His character, his attributes, these are everlasting as well. The Old Testament saints could trust in these characteristics. New Testament people could. We can as well all of those years later. The duration of God's existence and faithfulness should be a source of encouragement, and stability for us, no matter what circumstances we are in. Now, the rest of the psalm, and I'll go through this quickly, addresses the threat of the waters and the floods. The floods have lifted their voice, but then it says at the end of verse 4, the Lord on high is mighty. The floods will never overwhelm us. I listed the rain last night. I thought maybe it would overwhelm us. It got pretty close. There's a pretty big storm, at least where we were. Nonetheless, the rains will not overwhelm us. And then that last verse, that he regulates the universe with his word. Truth and holiness govern his reign. As it says, your testimonies are fully confirmed. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. I want to mention a few things about this idea about the majesty of God. First, it's important to just keep in mind that God is everywhere majestic. Everywhere, at any moment, his full presence, his full glory could be manifested. We see it instances of those things happening in the Old Testament. There's no place where we can go where we are outside the range or the lunge of the majesty of God. You say, oh, I'm in a really tough situation. Well, guess what? The majesty and rule and reign of God is right there as well. The more you are trying to align yourself with the Word of God, the more beneficial, as we've seen from some of these Psalms, the more beneficial that will be for you. The more you try to think you can run away. It's funny, we read about Jonah, and we know the story of Jonah well. The sense that, yeah, he's a God of all nations. He's a great God. He's not just one of these local deities. But a sense that somehow, geographically, I could go far enough away from God, from my responsibilities, from my obligations to that God. And it was impossible for him to do that. I think sometimes we think, well, I could just mentally or functionally get as far away from God as possible. There is no place we can go where we are getting away from the majesty, from the view of the throne room that he is looking at us, and he is reigning and ruling all things from that place. I want to mention, I'm kind of give you a little bit of a tool here too, and I got to thinking about this idea of God majestically reigning from his throne. It seems like we hear about school shootings every couple of weeks or months anymore. We're almost kind of doesn't have the impact on us that it used to. But we hear about hurricanes and tragedies and these kinds of things happening, and people always ask, where was God when tragedy struck? You have an answer for that. It's a clear answer. It's not just an evangelical cliche, and I don't want to just bowl over the tragedy and the human loss and the heartache, but there's a really good answer. Where was God when tragedy struck? God was on his throne. By the way, that's where you want God to be. God wasn't taking a break. God wasn't, I'm getting a sandwich. God is always, by the way, that's the beautiful thing about God. He never needs to take a break. There's no sleep. There's no slumber. When things go horrifically wrong, what do we say? Where was God? God is exactly where you want him to be. God is on his throne, reigning and ruling with majesty beyond understanding, beyond parallel, beyond anything we can ever imagine. He is reigning. He is allowing. Sometimes that means he is giving permission for certain things to happen for a grander reason than we could imagine. You know, if we saw anything from Psalm 90, it was this idea of 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, or 1,000 years in our sight is like yesterday when it's past. The scope of God, the breadth of his knowledge and vision, the duration of his existence is so far beyond us that we say, oh, why did God do this, or why did God do that? We're talking about God reigning on his throne. To question that, I think, is we can ask God questions. We can bring our concerns to God. Certainly, we should in prayer, but also to have the humility to know that God is in charge. Where was God when tragedy struck? He's right on his throne, where he always is, where he always will be. Sometimes allowing things to come into our lives that we don't like, but he's a grander purpose than just our life. We always talk about God is less interested in our happiness and more interested in our holiness. Sometimes it takes difficult things into our lives to help us to understand his holiness. We're often worried about many things: international threats, financial downturns, other very real dangers, and then relationship, emotional things. We're not immune from disease and danger, but appreciating on and meditating on God's majestic rule should chase away a lot of that fear and doubt. Let's jump over to Psalm 95. And again, I hope you will really think through these psalms and these attributes that are being described and listed here. We talked about the majesty of God from Psalm 93. We're going to move on to the greatness of God in Psalm 95. Let's start with verses 1 and 2. Psalm 95, 1 and 2, he says, "O come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." So Psalm 95 begins with a series of exhortations. Those in verse 1 are that we sing and that we shout joyfully. So whenever you say, "Oh, wow, we come and we sing the hymns," we should be shouting and singing joyfully to the Lord out of joy, out of a thrill for what God has done in our lives. I like that phrase where he says, "the rock of our salvation." God describes himself as the rock of our salvation, and we see other. I've got it on your hand at other places where he says a rock or a fortress or a rocky crag where someone can find protection and provision. These images point to the stability and trustworthiness of God no matter what else is happening around us. By the way, sometimes we look at what's going on around us and all we can see is what's going on around us. As though God were also stuck in this maelstrom of difficulty and chaos and trial. God is above all of these things. He allows us in them so that we will look to Him, so that we will trust in Him. But He is our rock and our salvation, even in the midst of those things. I love these. Then he goes on in verse 2 with some more. By the way, these are called, I'm going to give you a little more grammar here if I haven't put you entirely to sleep yet, but a little more grammar. When you see the word let us, these are what they call cohortative exhortations or cohortative. If I say, "you do this," that's imperative. If I say, "let's do this together, both of us," that's cohortative. It's a little gentler of a way of commanding someone to do something because you're saying, I'm not just saying you need to do this, I'm saying, let's do this together. But it is also bringing people together for the sake of worshiping and rejoicing in who God is. So we look at all the let us's we have. We have verse 2, "Let us come before his presence. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." There's this series that we're going to continue to come before him. We're going to continue to meet. Again, that first one in verse 2, "Let us come before him." And the word "to come before" really means to gather, to congregate. I was talking to someone recently, and it's great that we're taping and we're putting things online, but don't don't be mistaken. It's important that we gather together on Sunday mornings. It's important that we gather together, that we encourage one another, that we greet one another, that we share gifts, that we eat around the tables, that we talk over coffee. It's important that we come on Sunday mornings and do these things together. And I know sometimes some people, they are not able to get out and they watch online, and that's fine. But we need to gather together. We need to come before the Lord together. Obviously, here he's probably talking about coming into the presence of God at the temple, but we need to do this at church as well. By the way, he's also saying, then let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us come to him joyfully. And it kind of prompts the question: do we do this? Do we do this with thanksgiving and with a joyful sound, or do we do this out of some kind of a obligation? Where are you on that spectrum when it comes to singing a hymn or a newer praise song or listening to a message? Are you on the joyful sound side or are you on the ritualistic obligation side? I know, or the guilt side. Oh, I got to do this. I got to be there. Oh, the pastor's going to call me if I miss a couple of weeks. So, we want you to be here joyfully, excited about hearing the word of the Lord, excited about singing these songs, exciting about what the Lord has done for us. He goes on in verse 3. Finally, in verse 3, we kind of get the reason for all this activity, and that starts with the word "for." The word "for" is is a conjunction of explanation. You're getting a lot more grammar today. If you knew you were going to get this much grammar today, you probably wouldn't have come. But this is helpful grammar. When you see that "let us," again, that's an invitation. When you see "for," that's an explanation. Why do we do this? Why do we gather? Why do we sing? Well, we want to see our friends. That's fun. We want to hear about how to live better, be blessed. Why are we here? Why do we do this every week? Why do churches build buildings and do music and do all these things? I hope it is for the reason listed in verse 3. Not because the church is great, not because the music is great, not because of the preaching. For the Lord is a great God. If we are as churches meeting for a reason other than the greatness of God and the glory of the gospel, I don't think we're meeting for the right reason. If we're meeting to raise money, if we're meeting to get people saved, as important as that is, I don't know if that should be really our primary motivation. Those are great benefits if those things happen. Why do we do all these things? Because the Lord is a great God. In fact, the explanation or reason that the Lord is great, it's repeated. The word gadol, to be great, is repeated twice in this verse. For the Lord is a great God and great King above all gods. Now, again, we talked about this before. Among ancient pantheons or any imaginations of humanity, God is greater than any deity that we could craft on our own. Again, God is greater than any pantheon that any Greek or Roman civilization could ever concoct or craft. The author here, and we see this kind of language in Psalms, the author is not legitimizing pantheism or legitimizing these other pantheons, not saying, or polytheism, not saying that these are legit. Well, there's lots of gods and then there's our God. He's just, rather than arguing with someone that says, well, these are the gods that I believe in, rather than arguing with them, we just say, okay, I'll concede that. Of course, the gods of these worlds are probably demons, honestly. But okay, you have this cultural set of deities. Our God is still better. Our God is still superior. Our God is still greater than those other gods. I was thinking, what is a modern pantheon? What are modern gods we worship? We worship technology. Our God is better than technology. I appreciate technology. Nothing wrong with technology. We use it all the time. But our God is greater than that God of, or that reverence for technology today. We revere medicine, and I like medicine. It's great. It's helpful. God has given us these things, but it shouldn't be something that we revere or put all of our hope in. We put a lot of hope in self. So it's not just the ancient people that had pantheons. We have them too. We have these array of things we put our hope in, our trust in, other than God. Better just to worship God and serve him exclusively, as it says. He's a great king above all gods. Better just to worship and serve him. The greatness of God should drive our worship, our service, our humility, and our piety. And as though to just illustrate the greatness of God, I love these next few lines. And maybe next week we'll kind of get into the rest of this chapter here. But look what he says in verse 4. In whose hand are the depths of the earth? The peaks of the mountains are his also. What an incredible way. There are mountain peaks that people have a very hard time getting to. They go off on an exploration. A lot of people don't make it trying to get to some of these mountain peaks. They tell us that there are places in the oceans we have yet to explore. We can't get to them. God's holding the oceans. He's holding the waters. He's holding the earth, the depths of the earth, in the palm of his hands. And then we have an affirmation of God as creator of all things in verse 5. The sea is his, for it is he who made it. His hands formed the dry land. And then a great implication of worship in verse 6. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our God, the Lord our Maker. By the way, this is really interesting. Again, we talked about this a little bit. I think it was last hour we talked about this. If your worldview starts with you, then it's wrong. If it starts with evolution or development of the human species or something like that, it's wrong. It's got to start with, in the beginning, God created. It has to begin with God as creator, sustainer, and center of our worldview. And everything is driven from that. The fact that he created us perfectly with his image, the fact that we also rejected that glory, and we fell into sin and corruption. And that is a perpetual legacy that we pass on to the next generation. the fact that God needed to intrude into that situation with the Savior, Jesus Christ, to save us from our sin, and that by his grace we can be saved. This is all part of what it means for God to be the center of our worldview, for God to be creator, for us to recognize his greatness in everything that we do. So we see this his greatness, the implication to worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our God, our Maker. By the way, I think it's kind of interesting. We don't do this often. I don't know if you ever do this in your prayer life. It would be weird if you came in here and we were singing and we're down on our hands and our knees with our hymnal. That would be a little awkward. Maybe something we should do. There's something about that posture of humility that I think we lack, that maybe we should revive, maybe in your prayer life. Every once in a while, I will bow down on my knees and take my little prayer cards and my prayer lists and pray, utilizing that posture. It really does something for your mind the way the way you shape your body. I'm just kind of sitting there in my chair and praying. It's a little more casual. Sometimes you have to fall down on your knees and pray and worship the Creator of all things. And by the way, what do we have in verse 4? I'm sorry, in verse 7, we have another 4, F-O-R. For he is our God. Why? Why do we worship? Why do we do this? For he is our God. We are his people, the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. And then it goes on into a great thing. In fact, I think we talked about this when we were in Hebrews about how the children of Israel, they hardened their hearts at Meribah and Massa. They did not heed the word of the Lord, even though he was their deliverer, their creator, that he chose them specially to be a nation unique to him. They still rejected that. And he, in turn, allowed many of them to perish in the wilderness as they endured a 40-year trek across the desert. He is great. We have to be careful of maybe allowing too casual of a relationship to come into our fellowship with God. We have to remember that as much as he loves us, as much as he is concerned about us, he is God. He is great. And by attaching ourselves to that greatness, I think we will find a lot of refuge there. The entire book of Psalms really is focused on the greatness, the vastness, and the majesty of God. And yet we continually underestimate him. We squander our attention on other things. We focus on ourselves. We focus on our greatness. Uh, we at our church in Dunwoody, there was a couple that sometimes lived up here. Sometimes they had another place that down in Noonan, and they had a little lake that I think they had created it, or it was a small one, they made it a little bit bigger. But they let us go down and we take the teens down there and we camp out. It was really great. But the coolest thing was to go out on one of the little piers that went into the lake at night and to look up at the stars. You don't know how much, I never knew what light pollution was. It's a thing. You go out of your house and you're too close to Atlanta to really appreciate, oh, there's a couple of stars there. Down in Noonan, you look up and you see it's like a galaxy full of stars. You have a grand appreciation of how great God is. For him to put every star in place, to name every one, to have planets perhaps rotating around each one of those. For him to know every single one of them, to know how much life they have left in them, to manage all of these things, and have an appreciation at that moment for my own smallness and his greatness. And to think, you know what, I spend a lot of time underestimating God and overestimating myself. Read through the Psalms, any psalm, and try to look at it through the lens of, I need to make sure I don't underestimate God, and I need to make sure I don't overestimate myself. I think the church is struggling in its battles today because it has vastly overestimated our prominence. We got podcasts, we got publishing, our influence, and we have profoundly underestimated the power and the might of God. I want to encourage you on a personal level too. Don't underestimate the greatness of God. Every worry, every time we doubt or we question God's love for us is an affront to God's greatness and an insult to his love for us. He could not have shown you love more than sending this baby born in the manger to grow up, live a perfect life, die on the cross for your sake, be raised from the dead. I don't know love greater than that. Don't ever underestimate how great he is and how much he loves you. And don't overestimate yourself. Don't underestimate God's ability to make a difficult situation turn out for the best, to answer prayers that we have prayed for decades, to help us overcome sin and conquer temptation, or to conquer our spiritual and intellectual enemies today. I think we have to be a people, churches that have a renewed appreciation for the majesty and for the greatness of God. And I think that He will do great things with that. Well, we'll leave it there. We'll dive into Psalm 96 next week because I think that's a lot. There's a lot of great things there about the superiority of God. I hope this is helpful for you. I hope that you will allow the greatness of God to be a great motivator in your life this week. And I hope you will remember how much He loves you. Let's close with, oh boy, this is one of my favorites. I'm going to cry. Oh, come all you faithful, number 80.